Good evening, or good morning, or good middle of the night, as may be the case, because I get the opportunity to do the first welcome to this marvelous group of transcontinental people who are joining us here, some from South Korea, Japan, some from Central Africa, one or two from Latin America, and a number of folks from the United States. And we're not only coming from different places, we are delightfully from certain different areas in the educational and activist sphere. We have a large number, 15, 16, 18 undergraduates. We have a number of master's students. We have 6 or 7 PhD people, a number of faculty, and a couple of folks who work for arms and peace organizations. And this marvelous mix really is going to give a vitality to our discussion that we're quite pleased about. Although we're a large group, we will spend a good part of our time in these 4 evenings following a presentation by one of our presenters with moving to small groups, so we have some good discussion. Our goals, as you know, because you probably looked at our goals and that's why you bounced into our session, is to develop a new generation, a whole new generation of Catholic actionists, intellectuals, religious, lay people who are thinking about the prospect of creating a world without nuclear weapons. We are at an interesting time for that. A number of our speakers will address that moment in time and its options and its characteristics directly over the last 4 days. And we seek to provide some basic presentations, some motivating presentations to our discussions, and also to, as you see in the schedule, give you an opportunity to meet some of the key organizations doing some of the more interesting work, at least in Washington, D.C. In a multi-week, multi-kind of person environment like this, we might very well say, it's Thursday, let's go to Geneva and the IAEA, or let's go right to the Vatican and have a little comment from the Pope about his November 2017 statement. But for now, in these 4 days, we're going to content ourselves with hearing the story and the work of 2 organizations, in addition to the different presentations, and especially our discussions among ourselves in the smaller groups. Each of the 4 major faculty that have come together to plan and will be with you for this week, we're all going to take a brief amount of time to introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit about the passions, interests, and maybe circumstances that drove us to be concerned about nuclear weapons and trying to rid the world of these nuclear weapons. So I've got the floor. I'll begin. My name is George Lopez. I am with the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And my story about dealing with nukes begins way back in October of 1962 in grade school in Brooklyn, New York, Our Lady of Angels Grammar School, where we are in the midst of the first drill where they pull down all the shades and turn out the lights in case the Russians attack us in the midst of this Cuban Missile Crisis. Hero Lopez, 7th grader, not to be denied, is hiding under his desk, but it's about 11 o'clock in the morning. So I reach up into my desk and pull out my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, start to open it up, only to have Brother Savio run down the roll and say, "You don't eat during a nuclear war." So my traumatic experience of dealing with nuclear war was early, deeply affected me, quite obviously. And with that little bit of comic relief, I will fast forward to being a middle-aged professional kind of professor type who not only was teaching a lot about nuclear weapons and what we might do about them, but also was able to have some great experiences with some of the organizations that are involved in this issue, particularly in my case, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. I think that's about it for me from now. And I'd like to turn it over to Jerry Powers, who's going to tell us not only about himself, but also about the hows and whys of how we all got here. Jerry.
Yeah, thank you, George. George is supposed to be retired, but we're doing what we can to keep him from being retired by asking him to help coordinate and moderate these seminars. This is the second one that we've done of this kind. And I want to thank Annie, who has helped organize and done all the logistics. You've heard a lot from Annie. So thank you, Annie, for all your work. Jerry Powers, I'm Director of Catholic Peace Building Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. I have a unique job, I think, in the whole world. There are lots of directors of Catholic studies. There are lots of directors of peace studies, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only director of Catholic peace studies. I also coordinate the Catholic Peace Building Network, which is it's a network of about 24 Catholic institutions, about half a dozen bishops' conferences, including the U.S. bishops, who are co-sponsoring this event or involved in this event, and relief and development agencies like Catholic Relief Services, Caritas Internationalis, independent Catholic organizations like Pax Christi International and the San Egidio Community in the United States, and then quite a few academic institutions like the Kroc Institute, the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, the Catholic Studies Program at Catholic U, and others. I've been here since 2004 and working on nuclear Catholic approaches to nuclear weapons and other things. Before that, I spent a little more than 17 years at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Office of International Justice and Peace, where I was responsible for staffing the bishops' work on nuclear weapons. And before that, when I got into this was in 1980, right after I graduated from undergrad. I was 10 or 15 years behind George Lopez, I think, but I worked for the San Diego Diocese Peace and Justice Office right out of undergraduate for 3 years. And that was at the time when the nuclear agenda was probably in the forefront of the public policy debates at the time. And so I was fortunate to be able to work on nuclear disarmament issues in the early years of the Reagan administration when it was a major issue. This seminar, again, this is the second week-long seminar we've done. The first was in May of 2019. And that was an in-person seminar back when we were allowed to do those things. It was a full week, and we had about 18 students from various places. So we're delighted to have the one benefit of the pandemic is we can go online and we can reach include a much larger audience. But this is part of a larger project on revitalizing Catholic engagement on nuclear disarmament. Now, why such a project? There's a real need. In the early 1980s, back when I was working for the San Diego Diocese, nuclear weapons was really probably the number one international issue. And one of the top issues, there's just massive engagement. There are millions of people in the streets of especially Europe and the United States and elsewhere protesting nuclear weapons. You were at the height of the Cold War. And the church played a major role. The U.S. bishops, who I worked for, issued a major pastoral letter in 1983 that really became a seminal document and led to and helped that letter and similar letters by the French bishops, the German bishops, and other bishops' conferences, as well as statements from the Vatican, really helped to get morality into the debate on nuclear weapons in a way that it hadn't been before, and also helped democratize the debate because it led to lots of activity in dioceses, parishes, Catholic organizations working on nuclear weapons. But at the end of the Cold War, of course, all that most of that activity died. Today we have, I think, new momentum. Pope Francis has really tried to put nuclear weapons at the center of Catholic concern. The Vatican was one of the first countries to sign and ratify the new nuclear ban treaty, which goes into effect next month. And in the United States, at least, we have a new Biden administration, which is expected to take a much different approach to nuclear weapons and arms control than the Trump administration did. But the problem we have is that relatively few bishops are involved in nuclear weapons and knowledgeable about the question. Scholars largely stopped writing about the ethics of nuclear weapons after the end of the Cold War. And many students, not all, obviously, since we have so many here with us, many students are very committed to social justice, but they're involved in other issues like environmental issues or the like. So we decided to begin this project back in 2014. And Annie, if you could share the summary with people. I'll just give you a brief rundown of the kind of things that we're involved in. The project is sponsored by the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame and the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, along with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Office of International Justice and Peace, the International Federation of Catholic Universities, which is based in Paris, the Catholic University of America's Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, and all of this with the generous support of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a major, which you'll learn more about later on in this week. As George said, we're trying to revitalize and strengthen the voice of the Catholic community in the United States and beyond in the debate on nuclear disarmament. And we're trying to empower a new generation of church leaders, scholars, and students to be involved. We've done sort of three main sets of things. One is we've tried to strengthen Catholic engagement on nuclear policy questions, mainly through a series of public events of one kind or another. We're beginning with a major event at Stanford University that was hosted by former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Secretary of Defense William Perry. We've had workshops and colloquia at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the House of Lords, which convene church leaders, scholars, and policymakers from 9 countries. We were collaborators with a major Vatican conference in November 2017, where the Pope gave a groundbreaking address and 11 Nobel laureates attended. You'll hear more about that. We, with the leadership of the International Federation of Catholic Universities and the Catholic University of the West in Angers, France. We did a conference there with NATO. We've done quite a few webcasts with the US and Japanese bishops this year, with the Catholic and evangelicals on New Start. And we just, in the past December, did a webinar that was hosted by the Berkeley Center with the Holy See Dicastery for promoting integral human development. We've also tried to catalyze some new scholarship on Catholic perspectives on nuclear disarmament. Drew Christensen edited a book called that published the Vatican, the proceedings from the Vatican Conference on Disarmament. He has another book coming out soon that he's edited on called Beyond Deterrence, looking at the pastoral and policy implications of the Church's position on nuclear weapons. And Maryann Cusimano is working on a book on God and the Bomb, A Just Peace in a Nuclear Age. And then finally, we have these seminars. We're trying to have annual seminars for students. We've started doing monthly webinars that are more informal, 1 hour each month that students can connect on this question. And we're hoping to do a major student conference in 2022 on this issue. So again, thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to the conversation over the next couple of nights.
Maryann.
Thanks, George, and welcome everybody. It's so great to see everybody coming for this discussion. I'm Maryann Cusimano from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And I've been working with Jerry and Drew and George and Annie and others on these issues for many years, for all the activities that Jerry just so helpfully laid out. I'm on the board of the Arms Control Association, and I've also helped to support the Vatican's diplomacy on the ban treaty at the Holy See mission at the United Nations. But on the point that we're raising tonight and through this session of engaging young people on nuclear weapons, you often hear about the downwinders, folks out west who are downwind of the U.S. nuclear atomic testing. You don't often hear about them on the East Coast, but I grew up in Pennsylvania, and in the late 70s and early 1980s. And there were a number of incidents there. In Apollo, Pennsylvania, there was an organization called NUMEC, the Nuclear Materials Equipment Corporation, and they were enriching plutonium, enriching highly enriched uranium. And there was a lot of pollution. A lot of that stuff went missing. There's a big kind of thriller. I expect someday to see it on a Hollywood screen of what happened to 300 kilograms of highly enriched uranium from that plant, from that corporation in Pennsylvania. Many hypothesize, they believe that that was the highly enriched uranium that caused Israel, that was the starter kit for Israel's nuclear weapons. But it remains a very highly toxic place to this day. And of course, also while I was growing up, there was the meltdown at the nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island. This made the home that I lived in unsellable. My parents were trying to move us to take a different job to Florida. As kids, we were like, yay, Disney World, let's move to Florida. But we were never able to do that because our family property became unsellable because of that pollution, being downwind of that. My sister and many of the kids I grew up with had unexplained brain tumors. And if you follow any of the downwinders, it's very, very difficult to prove environmental consequences and public health consequences, the humanitarian consequences of the nuclear weapons complex. But those are the issues that the Holy See has picked up. Those are the issues, ethical issues that we'll be talking about this week. And as George said, you're never too young to become interested in these issues or to feel that there is actually an impact on your own lives from these nuclear weapons issues. So I look forward to having these discussions with you throughout this week.
Thanks so much. Drew, you've rejoined us. Unmute yourself, Drew.
Sorry, I was butted out by Zoom or by the router system here at Georgetown, but I found a place where we could connect again. So I'm happy to be back with you all. Like the others, I'd like to welcome you all to our 4 nights of exploration of the issues of nuclear disarmament, both the practical issues and the ethical issues. And let me give a little background on myself. My first involvement came as a young professor when I was teaching in Berkeley, and the bishops were just beginning to discuss and organize their work on the ethics of nuclear weapons and deterrence back in the early 80s. And like a lot of the faculty, we moved around the San Francisco Bay Area talking to various university audiences and church audiences about the development of that document. And once it came out, again, kind of explaining what it did and debating with people. But the most significant thing was that following the issuance of the pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, the weapons scientists at Lawrence Livermore Labs came to their bishop, John Cummins, and asked if they couldn't have discussions with the theologians at the Theological Union about this document. And after about a year of back and forth, we put a program together that lasted 4 years, I think. Even when I was teaching in Notre Dame, I was still contributing to it. And it was a very consequential program because it really had influence on the career paths of these scientists. Some changed their careers as a result of considering the ethics of nuclear weapons. Some simply moved away from weapons development. Others decided, well, let's stay with verification and monitoring and use their expertise there. Others switched, as they could in those days, because of the program at Lawrence Livermore, into renewable energy development. And some simply went into academia, but they made life changes because they took the ethical issues quite seriously of the pastoral and thought that they, having studied it, that they needed to make some change. And they could stay involved, some of them thought, and others said, no, we need to distance ourselves entirely from this. My more recent involvement comes from a call I got in 2013 from Archbishop, now Cardinal Silvano Tomasi, while he was the Vatican ambassador to the UN in Geneva, and particularly to the Disarmament Commission there. and they were preparing for the humanitarian consequences meetings. They already had one in Oslo. The humanitarian consequences meeting or movement was a movement to look more closely at the recent knowledge about humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons, sponsored by civil society organizations and also by non-weapons owning states. Out of that, the Vatican prepared and I was part of the team that developed the document that was a study document for this process and was presented at the last session in Vienna in December of 2014, entitled Nuclear Deterrence, Time for Abolition, which laid out the various reasons for questioning the continuation of nuclear weapons and why they should be abolished. And following that, the Holy See got involved in preparations for the conference in 2017 on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The General Assembly put the group together. There were 124 states involved. The Holy See, ordinarily, that's the Vatican, doesn't vote on UN resolutions. It does vote in other organizations like the IAEA, but not at the UN. But the General Assembly gave permission for the Vatican to vote, and it cast its first vote in the General Assembly deliberation for the treaty, and was the first to sign and ratify the treaty. And so I've been working with them ever since on this issue. I think we very urgently need to be involved in the movement to abolish nuclear weapons. And that's because the problem of nuclear weapons has never been as complex or as risky. The structure of deterrence has broken down. There are no longer 2 nuclear powers, but rather 9, and only 5 of which are part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Even those at 5 don't meet up to their commitments to disarm in return for the non-nuclear weapon states not choosing to develop. So there's a real need there, but more so, it becomes very difficult to put a deterrence strategy together with relationship to 9 states, or even 4, as I would think the US would be concerned about 4 as opposed to just one opponent. Secondly, there's a modernization process going on in which states, the nuclear weapon states, are changing their weapons programs to make them more flexible so they can use them in conventional wars. So the fire break between nuclear and non-nuclear weapons will be violated. And also the weapons are being developed that will evade any kind of defensive measures and therefore make defense against a sneak attack very, very difficult. And so because of those breakdowns and the collapse of the architecture of arms control, there's a real urgent need to get people involved, people who will be involved in the long term on building the architecture of nuclear disarmament once again and moving the world towards nuclear zero. And so I hope that you will really seriously consider your own career choices as we go through this week and engage in some reflection on where you might go with what you learned this week. So welcome. It's good to have you here. I'm looking forward to meeting you.
I'm going to begin to share a screen with folks and hope that you see it there. And I'm going to take a little time here to try to pull some ideas together, some of which our colleagues have shared, so that we can then retreat into our groups and not only get to know each other a little bit, but have some ideas to play with. I have a kind of historical view here that I want to take. Going into this week, we recognize all of us are coming from different backgrounds, not only age and geography, but also different amounts of prior exposures. Some of you may be PhDs in physics who can tell us isotope design and various other kinds of things. Others of us are intro history, theology, or politics students. There's a huge amount of military, technical, scientific, and other things that go into the mastery to be an expert in nuclear weapons. And we don't expect any of us to be masters of this by the time we leave. We're going to try to develop some ideas with you and make some presentations that help you become more informed, not only about some weapon systems, but particularly the struggle we've had between weapon system development and religious and ethical informed questions. And we want to make you feel empowered and to be armed with a lot of ideas and hopefully also some new resources that we'll present as the week goes on to make you a more powerful, effective, and feel like you've got a place in this debate ongoing. We're going to go light then on the military stuff and the technical stuff and the scientific stuff. We will have some good discussion, particularly around deterrence and some doctrines and beliefs. But our main focus is going to be the ethical and Catholic religious tradition that intermixes with this doctrine and the dynamic debates, particularly, and the dynamic moments, as Drew and Maryann and Jerry were all sharing of the things of what now lie before us. Everybody thinks that they live in the most interesting or terrible of times, but there's ways in which if you feel that about nuclear weapons, you're actually correct. It's not that you're being just narrowly sort of ethnocentric about that. And I think our positionality in these debates, coming from different places, coming in different kinds of occupations, will be real helpful in our discussion. My goal in this brief presentation is to take us at about 50,000 feet in a quick historical view of the nuclear dilemma as it's unfolded. Implicit in what I'm going to say, I think, is a consistent theme, a theme of things relating to each other systemically. And I think I forgot to say at the outset, this presentation and some others aren't meant for you to be taking notes if you're trying to do that like crazy. You're going to get these presentations. Our schemes are going to be recorded. Every night's going to be recorded. You're going to be able to have access to this. So sort of go with the flow and the ideas, and that'll bring some good material for you to the discussion, and trust that later you'll be able to have access to this. My theme as I look across these decades is that there's a system reinforcing relationship between military and technological invention and creating weapons, and then more weapons creating a need for more military invention to have better nuclear weapons. And in the course of doing this, what we've done as humans over the last 70 to 80 years is we've commingled now new doctrines and some would say rationale for why these weapons exist and why they're necessary to keep us at peace. But there's always been a reality of people with the spark to challenge this weapon development and this cycle that reinforces itself ethically, legally, and religiously. For some, it's constraining development, slowing it down. For some, it's restraining that it can make new progress. Let's leave where it is. And for others, and for us particularly in this seminar, it's about how we develop a doctrine and a means forward to actually end nuclear weapons in our time. The history, as some of you know and others are probably aware, really begins in the 1940s and the dilemma that particularly the United States and Europe found itself in with the advance of the Germans and takeover of Europe and the reports that the Germans were developing a potential big weapon. And it was probably, given the physics of the time, something to do with splitting the atom. And that led to a sense of urgency in Britain and the United States. And in the United States in particular, as the group that was fighting the two-theater war in Asia as well as in Europe, there was also a concern about the need to not only beat Germany to the weapon, but the ability to have the weapon singularly. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States assembled former German scientists, British scientists, various others to develop this weapons potential. Much of it at the start underground underneath what's now the University of Chicago. In fact, the football field, the Stags Field at the University of Chicago. A lot of military theory and thinking went into this once there was the first test of the bomb. The notion was, even though Hitler had stopped developing the bomb, it seemed, because he couldn't control the advance of the Allies into Europe. And it looked to, by 1944, that Hitler was going to be defeated. It was only a matter of time. The focus about the use of the bomb became, unfortunately, against Japan, with the notion developed a military doctrine that the bomb would save lives, that the best way to secure Japanese surrender was not to invade. We could use this bomb. And we developed a kind of doctrine, an ethical argument, some would say, of military necessity. The best way to beat Hitler was to beat him to the invention of the bomb. We were already beating Hitler. Now the military necessity for the bomb was to save hundreds of thousands of US lives so they wouldn't have to fight street to street to secure a surrender from the Japanese. But for some, particularly in the military, we learned later that there was a political logic of military necessity. And that is, particularly in the second atomic bombing, to send a message to the Russians that the power that was emerging in the United States shouldn't be challenged by communism. Interestingly, the ethical developments in the late 40s that pushed back against this were from the very scientists that developed the weapon. So probably one of the most famous is the British scientist, Joe Rotblat, who founded later not only the Pugwash conferences, but was a major recipient of the Nobel Prize, one of the early Nobel Prizes for dealing with nuclear weapons. Robert Oppenheimer resigns. Gene Rabinovich, who was at a lower level, decides that the best thing he can do is to create a forum for all of these scientists to continue to have political and ethical momentum against the bomb. And he creates the famous Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists as a great publication and information source that's lasted to this day, just celebrated its 75th anniversary. I'm not going to cover every aspect of this to make sure we have enough time in our discussions, but what happened in the 1950s was interesting because not only was it clear there was an arms race, the Soviets were going ahead and developing their own bombs despite the American bombing to show them how dangerous that would be. And the big breakthrough to realize we were in a full arms race is when the Soviets tested what the Americans thought they singular had, not only a regular atomic bomb, but a hydrogen bomb. And we had now entered the reality that there was a weapons race in which the inner logic from the point of view of many national security thinkers was the best way to guarantee that your enemy doesn't use nuclear weapons against you is to have better and more, to have a kind of strategic deterrence. This also led to atomic testing. It led to a search for not only the bombs, but delivery systems for the bombs. And so you have an arms race, not only in the development of the bomb itself, but high altitude Air Force bombers, nuclear submarines, and silo-based long-range missiles. Again, the ethics for control seems to keep coming from the scientists. In the 1960s, you have a heightened Cold War because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a lot of development in the US system of what we thought were the best delivery systems, and the origins of what we called an acceptance in the society of mutually assured destruction. The best way to keep peace is we can kill them so badly and they know it, and they might respond in killing us badly, and that kind of mad system is what keeps the peace. Finally, in the 1960s does come some great discussions ethically of what's going on. Probably the most significant one for our discussion that our colleagues will talk about during the week is Pope John the 23rd and his great encyclical Pacem in Terris and his discussion of that before the United Nations. A lot theologically tied to the notion of the new and reinvigorated church from Vatican II, but also a focus on what was going on here with these destructive systems. In the United States, especially, we have the development of religious-based nuclear pacifism in the work of a number of those who not only had been opposed to war, like the war that was going on with the US in Vietnam, but extended that to the kind of weapon systems we were developing, folks like Thomas Merton and Phil and Dan Berrigan. What was going on in some other countries like Britain was a bit more secular. The women in particular were in the lead. And for those who think there's not enough gender dynamic in the nuclear arms movement, you're right. But the history is that there was some firm grounding, particularly in Britain. Despite all of this development, some of the ethics did push through some critical treaties. The ban finally on atmospheric testing in '63, the beginning of the control through proliferation of what would become the NPT by 1972, and the declaration that Latin America would be a nuclear-free zone in '67 through the Tlatelolco Agreement. '70s, big technological development, big competition with the Soviets. And I won't go into detail here. You'll be able to see it yourselves as you look through this over time. But the '70s also then posed to us some interesting ethical issues. It's not stated in any particular document. It's not stated outright by the rival superpowers who are running small proxy wars in Africa and Latin America. But there's an increased understanding between Soviet and American leaders that there'll be no resort to nuclear weapons in other areas. Their nuclear competition is against one another. It's, in a sense, civilizational, but they weren't going to be used for military purposes in other areas. There's even, with a kind of thawing of relations between communism and the United States, a greater ability to build some important treaties like the SALT Treaty and the ratification of controlling anti-missile systems. The election of Ronald Reagan brought to the fore a new kind of national security thinking that saw both a articulation that actually one small nuclear war might not be so bad for you in a particular region or a theater, meaning Europe, after all, that limited nuclear war could be survivable, and that for military reasons, we might want to develop some doctrines about low yield nuclear weapons that wouldn't kill people like crazy like it did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but might create a strategic advantage by taking out a particular section of fighters or a city or a port. Despite that, there was some concern with controlling even these attempts at building intermediate range missiles in the 1987 treaty. But the Reagan people also gave us a big notion called Star Wars, which was the concept of militarizing space, both with nuclear weapons and with anti-weapon systems. What's most significant now out of this period of time is that the Reagan administration believed by creating this mega arms race in the 1980s, and they had 2 4-year terms to be able to do it, they could essentially spend the Soviets into the ground. And so when Mikhail Gorbachev comes to the fore as the leader of the Soviet Union, and he begins to try to unwind the Cold War and deal with, yes, among other things, the inefficiencies of defense spending on the overall Soviet economy and the ending of the socialist economic dream, the lesson learned by many in the West was that our bold nuclear programs won the Cold War. So even though there could be ethical and other robust discussions of what was going on, in the political realm, many people believed if you want to keep the peace, make sure you're prepared for war, make sure you have strong weapon systems. Well, the body politic and religious organizations concerned about that rise in the 80s, in fact, thought differently. Significant transcontinental nuclear freeze movement that began in the 70s, but really takes to the streets in 82, 83, and 84. Our colleagues have referred already, and we'll talk again about the Challenge of Peace document in 1983 from the US Catholic Conference of Bishops, in which they not only have engaged in lots of dialogue with the Reagan administration officials to try to understand these new doctrines, but they give, for the first time, a strong statement about where does deterrence fit in Catholic thinking. And one of my favorite quotes is they give a strictly conditioned moral acceptance to the idea that deterrence and mad thinking is viable, is ethically viable. So they're looking for when that system will end so that you could have an ethical system. Also, at the end of the document, they say something very important to folks like you and me. Peacemaking is no longer and ethical commitment of faith. And that is partly what drives us this week, is how do we find ways to increase our peacemaking abilities? How do we join with the forces that began in the 1980s to bring this to fruition? 1985, also a very important part of the nuclear dynamic, with International Physicians Against Nuclear War winning the Nobel Prize. The 1990s, despite the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the nuclear competition, and the victories of getting some good treaties like strategic arms limitation and the like, Iraq, as a developer of weapons of mass destruction, leads to war and the beginning of a number of wars in the Persian Gulf that involves the United States. It leads to the labeling of a number of other states knocking at the door of wanting nuclear weapons for their status, for their defensive security. The shock at the end of the decade that Pakistan and India, South Asia, is in its own nuclear arms race as Pakistan tastes 5 nuclear weapons and India follows suit. So the picture as we end the 20th century is one of some progress, the end of the Cold War, but also a massive disappointment in the way that now other states want to proliferate nuclear weapons. As an indication of how the body politic sort of lulled itself to sleep, that things were getting better because the Cold War had ended and there were real reductions of weapons. A good example is the circulation of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists went from 37,000 a year in 1992 to down to 16,000 a year by 1997. I'm just going to say one or two other things here, and that is that, in a sense, the lessons of the nuclear arms race are these. If you care about ethics, if you care about religious values, if you care about law, it's difficult to keep up with changing technologies and military doctrines. We're a little bit like the posse following the people on the tracks that just robbed the bank in the old days. You're going to always lag a little bit behind. The US and the superpowers, although they had that arms race in the 1980s, they seem to be back at it. But at the same time, we have a Pope who's unique in calling for special action by US Catholics. And that's what we're here to address. So just before we go to our breakout groups, what I'm going to suggest is we use the great breakout groups to do a couple of things. Let's take some time and introduce one another. Maybe about a minute, 90 seconds each. Who are you? What do you study? Where are you from? And why are you here? What are you looking for from these four evenings? If there's time, we can ask some questions about some of the themes I've introduced, some of the things that are on your mind. And so without any further delay, I'd ask Annie, who is the all-powerful czar of the breakout groups, to find a way to, as we used to say in one space adventure, beam us up, Scotty. And we'll see you in about a half hour. Welcome back to 8:55 Eastern Time in the United States. A little bit later in the morning, finally, for those of you good people in East Asia who joined us, and yet deeper into the night for some of our African friends. And thank you again for everyone being with us. Maryann, it's all yours.
Thanks, George. I'm just going to start out with a screen share to share a little bit of why there is this moment, as George was saying, a greater sense of urgency right now, why we're having this discussion at this time about these issues. And in one of the, Jerry discussed that this is an ongoing project that we're part of. And one of our previous meetings with the Nuclear Threat Institute, we'll be taking you to a virtual visit to them this week. We heard from former Senator Sam Nunn, and one of his catchphrases that he likes to use, that he's used in our previous events and in his my interviews with him, is that we are in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. And this is a race that mankind must win. And so the question becomes, why is this a race at this time? And let me go, I'm sorry, that looks like I'm on the end instead of the beginning. So why is this a race, and why is this a race that we have to win at this time? Well, one of the reasons it's a race is because we now have more people on the planet than ever before. And so we are at 7.6 billion people on the planet right now, and we'll be moving to 9 to 11 billion, depending on which estimate you look at. And so that means there are more people endangered by nuclear weapons than ever before, that at previous periods in history when our population levels were not so high. So the highest number of people on the planet than ever before. And the people on the planet have more access to technology than ever before. Now, of course, there's great sides to that, like our ability to have this conversation with you tonight, technologically enabled, despite the pandemic. But there are some downsides to that as well, which means greater access to these technologies by a wider variety of actors, including to more dangerous technologies. We have more open economies than ever before. But again, the downside of that is that there's more avenues for proliferation of nuclear weapons, including black market proliferation of nuclear weapons. The person on this slide is A.Q. Khan, who was the father of the Pakistani nuclear weapons program. And he was single-handedly really responsible for black market sales of dual-use technologies that helped North Korea and other countries develop their nuclear weapons programs. So he was kind of the proof of concept, and what he did to put profit before people is really an avenue that's open to others. And there's a lot of cases every year where they're tracking down these dual-use technologies being bought and sold in the black market. The expansion of these new technologies also leads to new vulnerabilities. So means to proliferation that were not available before. Whether it's to stealing and hacking into these weapon systems, whether it's hacking the plans for them and stealing the plans for them, or whether it's using a nuclear weapons response to a cyber attack, something that the Trump administration said that they would do in the nuclear security strategy document, arguing that the U.S. might respond to conventional weapons attacks and to cyber war attacks with a nuclear weapons response. So this leads to a sense of greater urgency right now, that the guardrails are off, that many of the historic arms control and disarmament treaties that have reduced the number of nuclear weapons in the past have either not yet been renewed. So the New START treaty, the incoming Biden administration will have a very short time window to try to renew that treaty, or the United States has pulled out of many of these historic treaties, like the Trump administration leaving the Open Skies Treaty, leaving the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So a sense that these treaties that have kept us safe in the past or have de-escalated the arms race, that those are no longer with us. There's also a concern of erosion, not just of the laws, but also erosion of the norms. This quote here by Ronald Reagan, that nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, is referred to as the nuclear taboo. And that nuclear taboo, many are concerned that that is eroding because there have been threats to use nuclear weapons. Both, the Trump administration was threatening to use fire and fury against North Korea. Of course, North Korea also threatens the use of nuclear weapons, rising arms race between the United States and Russia in developing new types of weapons, and erosion of this norm against using nuclear weapons. And as I mentioned, concerns that terrorists would acquire and want to acquire dirty radiological materials that they could use in a dirty explosion, or actually acquire the weapons themselves. This also leads to a real disconnect between the countries that have nuclear weapons and the countries that don't. And most of the countries of the world do not have nuclear weapons. Most of the countries of the world are actually already in nuclear weapons free zones. And George mentioned in the opening remarks about the beginning of that process in Latin America, which is kind of spread across the world. So they don't really understand why these countries that have these legacy arsenals from the past should continue with these arsenals going forward. And so we're at this pivotal moment now where those countries have joined together, and those advocates and activists in those countries have joined together to bring about a ban, a global ban on nuclear weapons that will enter into force right now, this January. So a real disconnect between the countries that have nuclear weapons and those that don't. More people on the planet than ever before, more countries on the planet than ever before. The good news is there's more democracies than ever before, as shown in this graph. Still a lot of non-democracies around the world, but better than it used to be. And that also democratizes these debates about nuclear weapons. The idea that a few elites should make these decisions for the whole planet is not really a winning argument today, when there are more democracies than ever before and more people wanting to weigh in on these issues. So the activists that were responsible for bringing about the treaty to ban, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, won the Nobel Prize. And it's an example of that, not willing to sit back and wait till the elites or wait till governments address these issues, but putting pressure to move the nuclear arms control and disarmament agenda forward, and that pressure coming more from civil society, democratizing the debate. So the previous iterations of this meeting that we're part of tonight, we took students to meet with that new Nobel Prize winner, Beatrice Finn, and the ICANN network. And so obviously COVID prevents us from taking you physically into some of these rooms that other students have been able to go in the past. But it's an example also of the time that the Holy See and religious actors are increasingly engaged on these issues, also bringing greater urgency to the discussion, something we'll be talking about more this week. One last thing to note, when I mentioned that there's more people on the planet than ever before, thus more people that are endangered by nuclear weapons, those people on the planet are not evenly distributed. And the countries that are the youngest countries in the world, particularly countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are not nuclear weapon states. So, and many of the countries that are the largest nuclear weapon states, for example, Russia and the United States, have over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And Russia has a declining population and a graying population. So many of these younger countries, again, don't take that nuclear status quo for granted. They are not, the US is selling a position, and many of the nuclear powers are selling a position that nothing can be done, and these weapons have to be with us going forward. And many of the younger countries are not buying that argument. They're not enamored with the nuclear status quo. So that's some of the reasons why Sam Nunn is making this argument that we're in this race now between cooperation and catastrophe, a race that mankind must win. And we'll be unpacking some of that, both the challenges that we're facing at this moment in history, but also some of the positives of the increased engagement of young people and religious actors in trying to rise to the challenge of our current moment. So with that, over to you, George.
Maryann, thank you so much. Maybe I could ask you, before I hold forth a bit, of the multiple challenges, where do you see young people or a collection of these multiple cultures, multiple age groups we have, where can they make their biggest dent in moving a kind of Catholic vision forward?
In terms of the Catholic vision, one of the imprints of Pope Francis's engagement on these issues is the intersectionality, the connection of these issues. That nuclear weapons issues aren't a standalone issue, but they're also an environmental issue. They're also an issue of the misplacing resources, a theft from the poor, as he refers to it as. And I think young people are often very engaged on environmental issues, engaged in social justice and poverty issues. So seeing that nuclear weapons issues are not separate from those, but are a different face of those issues, I think is a great avenue to engage with young people on these issues today.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. We had the term intersectionality mentioned in our small discussion group, so I think there's some awareness there out there, and this solidifies it even more. Let me jump again, friends, to a little bit of a PowerPoint here. I think it's coming up. I hope it would. Here we go. I want to just highlight a little bit more in this historical dynamic for us, and building off the moment that Maryann has talked about. One of the great questions from our small group was, how do we know that the Vatican and this Catholic approach can really push back against this incredible trend? And one person also asked the interesting question, how do you incentivize people being more attracted to new doctrines, new ideas about security and weapons than the ones we have? And none of us are going to be naive to the power of politics and cultural dynamics of the last 70 to 80 years. We know we've got a very big stone to push up a hill here. But I find the 2000s, the decade that many of you started to grow up in and have now come to your maturity and 20 years later, instructive in this regard, because we ended the 20th century with this incredible end of the Cold War, some areas of cooperation. Yes, there were stress points. There were new states trying to develop nuclear weapons. We did have a reduction in nuclear weapons overall. In fact, I can show you some of this, that there was real progress made between the United States and Russia in the reduction of their weapons. If you see the period 1990 down to the 2000s, and even moving further in these decades, lots of reason for optimism. At the same time, something happened, particularly in Western thinking and in US thinking, that really showed that not only do ideas matter, but in some respect, the over-securitization of the planet matters. The decision that the enemies around us must be best dealt with by weapon systems and war were all part of changing some of the era of good feeling that was developing in the decade before. And so no one wants to deny that the 9/11 attacks didn't have a significant impact on the United States. But on that particular administration, the Bush administration, it meant that by 2002, the new national security doctrine developed that our greatest threat, the threat to Western civilization, if you will, is the combination of some states that are rogue states that don't believe in the rules of the system, terrorism, and particularly the alliance between terrorism and these rogue states, and weapons of mass destruction. And interestingly, rather than in that three-part dynamic, tackling the notion that therefore the United States should take the lead in dramatically reducing weapons of mass destruction, the new national security doctrine said the biggest problem is that terrorists want these weapons, and rogue states might be connected with terrorists to want these weapons, or even worse, rogue states, even without terrorists, they want the weapons, and there's 5 of us who have the weapons, and that provides security. So you have this dynamic where Iraq, North Korea, Iran, Libya, and some other states, because they're trying to acquire nuclear weapons, while I'm not arguing that they should acquire them, the power of Western economic sanctions and military doctrine moves against them to make them pariah states, whereas the Western states that hold the nuclear weapons don't seem to feel a need to do away with them so that no states would like them. We also have a kind of crack in the deterrence doctrine in that if terrorists are one of the great threats to acquiring weapons, how to get terrorism deterred when terrorism only worked when one state had a lot of weapons and the other state had a lot of weapons. So what I'm trying to argue is that in the first decade of the 21st century, we did a lot of idea invention that was based in some real threats and real concerns, but we increased the number of enemies and we increased the sophistication of the doctrine, which said that nuclear weapons shouldn't be in the hands of some of the world, but can be safely in our hands. And that doctrine probably wasn't going to stand not only the logic, but the ethics and the cultural views of the rest of the world. But we didn't know that in 2002. So what did it lead to? It led to some of these so-called rogue states still pursuing their weapons. It led to a terrible war of choice where in March 2003, the United States went to war with a country it had already vacated the weapons of, but didn't trust the country. So they thought they had to invade it to end the development of weapons. 2006, 2009, North Korea begins testing. Iran looks like it wants to test. And even though at the end of the decade, President Obama wins the Nobel Prize for trying to build a new logic of diplomacy and to talk about a world without weapons, in fact, there's very little his administration and his country does in his time in office and certainly after to move us in that direction. It therefore means that in 2010, a decade dominated by North Korea and Iran concerns comes. The Trump administration decides it's time to go and resurrect that idea of Star Wars, but call it the Space Force and creates its own agency for that. One of the ways you can squelch development of weapons is by bringing countries to the brink of economic and under a COVID system, health disasters by maximum pressure sanctions. And at the same time, you can go back to the logic of the more weapons, the better, and we can spend everybody else into the ground. And you develop this moment where not only do you isolate yourself from arms treaties that have worked, but you begin the process of a decade-long $400 billion approach to doing nuclear security. So with that as bringing us a little bit up to date, there was and is some interesting legal and ethical dimensions to this. The United Nations General Assembly votes to create a treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons. As Maryann mentioned, the founders of that movement win the Nobel Prize. Pope Francis issues a Vatican declaration probing the immorality of producing nuclear weapons, in which it's not enough any longer to not use. You have to consider it a moral obligation not to produce. And for some of us, it's also the implication to stop thinking about the role of these weapons in any kind of serious defense of our way of life. We're a couple of weeks away from that wonderful treaty coming into force. And we'll find out in the rest of the week that not everybody agrees that we ought to have total elimination of nuclear weapons. But that's one of the questions that as we go to our groups, we want to pose to you all. Is it ethical to think about the complete elimination of nuclear weapons? Is it more ethical to think about everybody having an equal number? What's the ideas we can invent or should invent if the dominant ones are terrorists and rogues and weapons together is the great threat to all of us? What ideas can we invent and separate? Or what ideas have you run into in your own study that we ought to be pushing harder than those particular set of ideas? Do my colleagues have any other questions they want to add to the ones we've posed to our good groups? Okay, Annie, you again play the role of Scotty. Beam us up. We want to do two things at the end here. One is to tell you tomorrow night's very exciting because we go on our first class field trip, a virtual field trip to the Nuclear Threat Initiative and the good people who were created by Sam Nunn as a way to institutionalize a vibrant organization in Washington that would both be grounded in the realism that we've got threatening technologies, we've got to learn how to manage them, we've got to do various things, but there is a way forward that might reduce this dramatically. And we'll hear about that in detail and have some good opportunity to talk with those people about this. Secondly, we would benefit a lot if, as we come to a close, each of you take a couple of minutes to put in the chat room what your reaction is to how things went tonight. What worked for you, what didn't work. The floor is open. We'll be delighted to be able to read your chats as we do some debriefing and make sure we're servicing the needs and interests that brought you here. So thank you for your time this evening, and thank you for entering your comments in the chat room.